Hey friends, it's Sam from DIY Huntress, and this is Titan. And as much as he wishes that this was a dog-related video, it is not. Sorry, bud. If you've been subscribed to my channel and watching my videos, you'll know that over the past few weeks, I have been building things using the insanely impressive hoarded collection of lumber that I have in my shed shop. Fortunately, but unfortunately, today's video is no different. I'm going to show you how I made a waterfall entryway bench using one 8-foot board of walnut that I had stocked away in the ceiling of my workshop for about 5 years. I also added a really cool metal detail on the bottom using metal piping that I got delivered to me from my local home improvement store. I'm actually pretty excited about this one, so let's get started. Ready to get started? No, you just want to hang out here all day? We're just going to hang out here.
This project is sponsored by my friends at DAP. So, like I mentioned in my introduction, with everything going on right now in the world, it has been really hard to source lumber for projects, and I am feeling eternally grateful for all of the lumber that I've been hoarding in the ceiling of my workshop. Also, if you've been following me, you will know that I am currently in the process of moving into a new apartment, which has sparked so many ideas for new furniture pieces and projects. I seriously cannot wait to share my new space with you guys in a couple of weeks on my channel, along with some rental tips and how I'm integrating my custom furniture into our new space. So if you're interested, definitely make sure to subscribe. But in the meantime, I'm trying to not get ahead of myself here. Let's focus on the current build. So I have this one gorgeous piece of walnut that has been stocked away for a couple of years. It was actually gifted to me by a woodworker who was unfortunately going out of business, and I promised him that I would do something really cool with it, and this project just felt like the one. The board has such amazing character and this really cool grain pattern, so I knew that I wanted to use it to make a waterfall bench where the grain is continuous and can be seen when you look across the entire bench as a whole. Now, to get started with this process, I had to make my first cuts, and I decided to use 36-inch steel tubing for the bottom shelf of this build, which meant that I had to cut the top shelf at 36 and about a ½ inch extra to make room for inlaying the pipes later. Now, if you're visual like me, this would probably make so much more sense if you head on over to my website where I have all of the dimensions of everything I used, as well as a step-by-step with photos. Ultimately, once I figured out my measurements, I then set my track saw to 45 degrees and began to make the cuts for the edges of my waterfall bench as well as for the top of the legs. At this point though now, I had beautiful mitered edges for the ends of the bench and for the tops of the legs, but they were not continuous grains. So in order to get the continuous grain, I then brought these boards over to my miter saw, where I set my miter saw at a 45-degree bevel, and I basically made the complete opposite mitered cut that I made with my circular saw. You'll see why this works in a couple of moments when I show you how the continuous grain comes together, but basically by cutting the opposite way, now the miter will be flipped onto the other edge, and the other edge is the actual side that matches the grain for the top of the bench. Now, as I make this cut, one thing that I do want to mention is if you don't have a track saw, you don't need a track saw. You can actually use a circular saw with a straight edge guide for this project, and that works just as beautifully. I used one in my resin river table, so you can check out that technique in that video. Same thing goes for the miter saw as well. You can swap that out for a circular saw for this project. Once all those beautiful waterfall mitered edges were cut, I just made sure that the grain matched up, labeled my pieces, and then brought them back to the miter saw to cut them to their final size. Luckily, the board that I was using was a true 1x12 board, so I really only had to cut the legs to their final height, which was 18 inches. But again, you can find all of the details on measurements as well as all of the supplies and materials that I use for this project on my website by clicking on the link below this video. Once the side pieces were cut to their final height, it was then time to prep them for the metal shelf. And to do this, I measured how high I wanted the shelf to be and then used painter's tape in order to mark out that location, because I am going to be using a Forstner bit to drill the holes for the piping, and I didn't want to have massive tear out on my beautiful walnut board. After prepping the space, I then began to plan where I wanted to put the piping, and I really only knew of the first 2 spaces, so I only marked those 2 first because I wasn't sure if I wanted 3 pipes or 4 pipes. I'm telling you guys, a lot of this is like wing it while I go, which is crazy, but the reality is sometimes you think something's gonna look good and then it actually doesn't, so I would rather just be safe than sorry. Now, in terms of logistics for this Forstner bit, I ended up using 1-inch hollow steel piping for the shelving on this bench, so I used a 1-inch Forstner bit to drill the openings. And since I cut my bench a little longer than it needed to be to accommodate these pipes, because I didn't want to have to cut the pipes at all, I did actually drill these holes deeper than 1/4 of an inch each to just leave some extra breathing room and wiggle room for when I'm gluing and squaring things up later. At this point, I ran a test fit and tried to figure out whether I wanted 3 or 4 pipes for my shelf.
Yeah, I kind of like the 4 better. I think we're gonna go 4. 4 it is!
After some back and forth and a lot of talking to myself, I finally decided to go with 4 pipes and then just drill the openings for those pipes the same way that I did the first few openings. And once I was happy, I then removed the tape and moved on to the next phase of this build, which was joinery for the waterfall edges. Now, little disclaimer, there are tons of ways to glue up and join waterfall edges of projects. There are so many videos on YouTube about this process. I probably inhaled every single one of them before starting this build. I mean, seriously, it's impressive. You can do dominoes, you can do splines, you can do pocket holes, you can do dowels, you could do biscuits, but ultimately the reality is that I have a biscuit joiner in my shop. I absolutely love using it, and so I decided to use biscuit joinery for this project. Now, I've definitely run into issues before where my biscuit joiner has broken through the barrier of the thinner portion of the miter on projects, so I used a spacer block here to just prop the biscuit joiner up towards the top of this miter, which is actually the underside of the bench. And sorry about my arm stealing the show there. I'm obviously not the best at picking my shots sometimes when I'm using the biscuit joiner, but essentially I just added biscuits to every single mitered edge, including the legs and the top, and I ended up doing 2 per side. Now here's the thing, I know some of you are thinking, well, what about the strength of the miters? Are they going to break? Here is my thought process. If I wasn't adding the shelf to the bottom of the waterfall bench, which is going to reinforce the entire build, I would be totally skeptical about using just biscuit joinery in a waterfall bench. I'd probably actually try to do splines or borrow somebody's domino, but I have used biscuit joinery in other projects that are essentially big hollow boxes, and they've worked beautifully and held a lot of weight, so I'm really not too worried about this bench. I've honestly made other entryway benches on my channel before that had mitered edges that didn't have any joinery, just glue, and they're still holding up phenomenally, so I think this is going to be okay. Now, while I run the dry fit and complain about all the sanding I'm about to do, I do want to tell you about my friend Tamar's bench because she published a really similar entryway bench to this one today. The major difference between hers and mine, though, are that she used some rounded edges on her bench and also used brass instead of steel. So definitely make sure to check out her video on her build if you're looking for some other ideas for cool joinery options and cool edging options on an entryway bench. Now back to the build. So after dry fitting everything, I gave the inside of the bench its final sanding because it's going to be so difficult to sand this later, and I ended up sanding all the way from 80 grit to 220 grit. I then used painter's tape to mask the inside edges of the bench, and this is just going to help the glue from running out of the seam when we glue it up in the next few steps and then ruining the really beautiful sanding job that I took forever to do. But at this point, I wasn't ready for glue up just yet. There was one more thing that I needed to do to prep the boards before I could get ready to add any glue. So gluing up waterfall edges can be really tricky because you can't just add clamps and hope for the best. So I decided to add some cawls to the outsides of the waterfall edges. And what that means is that I took some scrap pieces that were cut at 45 degrees and then I applied them to the boards using some rapid fuse, and these are going to hold nice and tightly for when I clamp things together later. Now, before you yell at me, I did this wrong, so don't do what I did here. I applied the CA glue directly to the scrap wood cawl, but what I should have done was added another piece of tape to the scrap wood, applied the rapid fuse to the tape, and then essentially you're gluing the 2 pieces of tape together. I have seen videos where people have glued the cawls directly to the piece of walnut and then sanded the CA glue away later, but I was really nervous about this. I did not want to ruin the walnut pieces, so I just stuck with the tape method. I learned my way the hard way during glue up that what I just did here wasn't working, and I did fix it, I promise. But let's not dwell on past mistakes and move forward. So once the wood was finished being prepped for the glue up, I then had to prep my metal pieces, and I started by using a torch to remove any of the stickers and the sticky residue. I then wiped that down using a wet cloth, and then I polished the entire bar using a Scotch-Brite pad. And then once all of the shelving pieces were prepped, I then inserted them into one side of the bench before attaching the other side of the bench and then running a dry fit of everything before moving on to the glue up. And if there's anything that I learned here, it's that I am never not running a dry fit of a glue up ever again, because I noticed so many mistakes in my process once I did this, including the issue with the calls. So I went ahead and I fixed that, and then once that was working, I felt a little more confident about starting the glue up, but I'm never fully confident about glue ups. They just make me really nervous. One of the things I was really nervous about in particular on this build was how I was going to tackle applying the metal pieces to the wood without them drying too fast to be able to square everything up and then apply glue to the waterfall edges. Like, I was literally so nervous about this that I actually scheduled a call with one of the product managers at DAP to figure out what would be the best way to go about this, and he recommended this tank bond resin with accelerator, and it basically bought me about 6 hours of cure time so that I had enough time to manipulate the metal pieces and square everything up, all while working on the wood glue joints for the waterfall edge.
I'm having hot flashes.
After a minor heart attack, I was then ready to tackle the waterfall edges, and I applied an ample amount of carpenter's glue to these joints and also made sure to get the glue inside of the openings for the biscuits as well. I then began the process of rushing against the clock to get everything glued up and clamped into place, and this always makes me so nervous. I don't know if you guys get like this. Let me know in the comments if glue ups make you nervous as well. I wish that they were as easy as they look when I speed up my videos, but the reality is they're not, and when you're racing against the clock, it's so important to be in the zone, and that's exactly what I did. Another important thing to note here is that I repeatedly checked for square on all of my edges and corners when gluing things up, and once I was happy with how square everything was, I then tightened all the cauls to make sure that the edges would glue together tightly.
Okay, I'm done. That was so stressful. I never want to glue up anything ever again in my life. I need emotional support. It's time for some Sour Patch Kids.
After eating my feelings in Sour Patch Kids and a good night's sleep, I came back the next day and began to remove the clamps, and to my surprise, it actually glued up super beautifully, and I was really happy with the outcome. But the real test was a strength test, and I decided to give it a shot along with my brother.
Alright, let's see if these biscuits are gonna hold my weight. I'm scared to sit.
Crack, no, I'm kidding.
Feels okay. What do we weigh collectively?
30. About 240 pounds.
240, so
Yeah.
this bench can hold 240. I think I might have like 240 pounds of sneakers, so... Alright,
No comment.
I gotta sand it. Let's do this.
Once I felt better about the weight, I then began the sanding process, but did notice that my mitered edges did not glue up as tightly as I wished that they did. So a little trick that I found online was to add some wood glue to the joint, rub it in nice and tightly, and then use a screwdriver to just flatten down those edges together. I then used 120 grit sandpaper to create this gummy, sawdusty paste that filled in the gaps within the seam, and then I sanded everything down nice and neatly using my random orbit sander. And honestly, the biggest life lesson that I learned here was I would be a really, really bad magician because I give away all of my secrets, and the reality is I don't think anybody would have even known that that seam wasn't tight if I didn't show you this trick. But once I was happy with the edges, I then sanded the entire bench all the way to 220 grit, and then I actually decided to finish the entire bench using a spray enamel because of the metal. I actually really like this product, and I sprayed about 3 or 4 coats on the bench itself and sanded whenever I needed to in between coats. I then let it dry overnight before moving it into the house. As much as it stinks to not be able to just go to the lumber store or the hardware store and pick up what I need right now, I am loving using some of this reserve lumber that I have stocked away in my workshop because it really is challenging me to get creative about my joinery and to make new pieces. And while I hope this piece finds its way into my new apartment, I do think my mom is probably going to steal it first, but either way, I am still really excited to show you guys my new place in a couple of weeks. So if you guys are interested in tagging along on some more projects in the near future, definitely make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell. But until then, friends, as always, thank you so much for watching and supporting what I do. I cannot wait to show you my next project, and happy DIYing.